The Bliss Business Podcast, the show about empathy, connection, and consciousness in business. Today's episode is brought to you by Zero Company, your paid search, social media, and programmatic ad experts.
Hello, and welcome back to the show. Did you know that organizations where emotional intelligence or EQ development is a priority are 22 times more likely to be high performing? We're diving into EQ today with our guest and how it can elevate leadership, your sales team, and transform the workplace. I'm Steven Zakash here again with Mike Lewski. We are live, so if you have questions or comments, send them along. Mike, introduce our guest today.
Hey, thanks, Steven. Really appreciate that. And certainly we are excited to welcome Blair Carey, the managing partner of InsideCRO, to our show today. A little bit about Blair. So Blair has over 25 years of experience in building and leading data-driven sales organizations. And for all of us, this is certainly an area that we can always improve. So I'm sure we're going to benefit from his insights greatly. He's worked with companies across a wide range of industries, from startups to really large established enterprises. And this has helped him really be able to drive a sustainable growth model by blending that emotional intelligence that we're going to talk about today with data-driven strategies. And beyond his business experience, Blair's also pretty passionate about hockey and golf, which can keep him grounded and connected. And I can certainly see, Blair, how hockey and golf can do that to you. They are pretty good at keeping us grounded. And so with that, Blair, we're thrilled to have you on the show. Welcome to our show.
Thanks very much. I really appreciate it. I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Blair, so let's kick us off talking a little bit about your background in leading sales teams.
Sure.
Maybe you could share how emotional intelligence kind of became parts of your leadership and your sales work. What sparked your awareness of its importance?
So up until, I would say, 2010, I was what I would call an individual contributor on the sales side. And that means that I was responsible for sourcing my own deals and really interfacing and interacting with prospects and managing customers throughout that entire period of time. I didn't really have to manage anybody or or be responsible for anybody else other than myself. But it really wasn't until I sort of was handed my first real team that I really started to understand what that was. And fortunately, because I had spent a decade or so in competitive rowing and became a high performance coach in competitive rowing, I had a little bit of information or inclination as to how that actually worked and how I could actually become a leader of a group of people who really had no idea about what they were doing. I had a specialty where I was what we call a development coach. So I would take primarily kids, whether they're 14 years old or 18 years old in college, teach them how to row and teach them how to become and learn how to become an excellent rower, as well as being part of a team. And so I was able to translate that into the sort of the business world. And when we think of a leader in a sales organization, we typically think of what Anthony Iannarino calls a direct leader, someone who is specifically directing people and telling people what to do. And what I found is that a leader who is open to ideas and open to concepts and realizes that people are people, that you move forward a lot faster than if you're constantly telling people what to do. Because, as anybody who has teenagers, and I have a few in my house, telling teenagers what to do doesn't really accomplish the outcome you're trying to achieve. So we hear a lot about getting people buy-in, getting your team to buy into your vision or your ideas. The reality is that the vision needs to be a shared vision and not just one that comes from the top down, even though it is what I call top influenced.
Yeah.
So One thing, Blair, that we know the audience always loves is examples. And so I was kind of curious from your experience when it comes to EQ, because it plays a really big role in being able to foster that trust, as you were just sort of indicating, and empathy within the team. So, could you share maybe an example with us where perhaps applying that EQ helped improve the team dynamics and maybe address like a major challenge or issue that you were faced with?
So I'm sure this is true in every company, but in sales teams in particular, there is a personality, a persona called the lone wolf. And the lone wolf typically is one or two of your top performers in your sales team, in your organization. They have developed their own way of dealing with prospects and customers. And because they are in that top performance area, most people in the organization just leave them alone to do their own business.
Sure.
So I was dropped into one of these organizations back around 2010 to 2011. It had a very small team, 3 people on the sales side. One of them was the lone wolf, who was bringing in 80% of the new business. And the other 2, one had just started the month before, and one had been around, who was a junior who was just starting to hit his stride. And I had to somehow corral the lone wolf into the organization and get him, it was a him in this particular case, to buy into the long-term shared vision of what the organization was.
Sure.
And the only way to bring the lone wolf in was to, at one point, appease them and listen to them, because a lot of the times the reason why the lone wolf is out there is because no one listens to them.
Right.
They don't feel heard. And again, we're going to go back to teenagers. If teenagers feel heard, they actually behave in ways that a normal person would behave. So bringing the lone wolf into the organization was a 2-year project of mine.
Wow.
And during that time, the team grew from 3 to 8, and with specialization of roles of what we would consider to be the modern sales motion today.
Wow.
And to the point where that person became the de facto leader of the organization so that I could go and run other parts of the business.
Gotcha. Wow, what a success story. And that, a very common challenge for sure that I think we come across in a lot of different companies. So, yeah.
Blair, so in business, we're often so focused on metrics. How do you ensure that your emotional needs of your team aren't neglected? Well, you're balancing those business goals and those, data-driven strategies. How do you do that? So you've got this lone wolf out there, and they're hitting some marks. How do you balance this while bringing everyone together?
It's a great question. So here's the thing. So first of all, I am a trained investment analyst. Okay, all the plaques on the back of the wall here, they're all investment related. I was trained as a classic investment analyst. I used to do equity analysis. I worked in private equity and private debt. So I'm not afraid of numbers. All right. But the problem that what I see today is when people say that they're data driven, they forget that there's context and nuance behind the numbers. And people get stuck behind their CRM screens or whatever analytics tools they're using, and they forget that there's real human stories. And so one of the things that I think it's important for people to understand, a leader who has a level of emotional intelligence understands this either the easy way or the hard way. Usually it's the hard way, but it's a real simple. We praise in public and we criticize in private. Because when we praise in public, and it has to be genuine praise. I've been in many organizations where the praise has been, I would say, less than genuine. And so the message doesn't get delivered in the way that it needs to get delivered. So So when we praise in public, we're basically elevating and telling people about the amazing progress a person has made from where they are. And if you've, read some of Dan Sullivan's works, there's a book called The Gap and the Gain. Okay. And the difference between the gap and the gain, okay, is the measurement of your progress from where you were, not where you're going. So if you're trying to run a 4-minute mile and you're currently running a 6-minute mile and you're training every day and you're putting in the work and you go from 6 minutes to 5 minutes, that is a significant gain towards your goal of 4 minutes. However, the people that live in the gap are still worried and upset that they're not at 4 minutes yet. So what we need, the way we need to be thinking about this is that when we're talking to our people, we need to understand how to help them stay in the gain and recognize where they were and where they are today. Mm-hmm. And so as a sales leader, one of the things that it's really important to me is to provide regular feedback and as soon as possible to all of our team members on specific performance pieces. So when I have a new salesperson who joins the team and they start doing introductory calls or review calls or whatever the case is with prospects, I do my best to attend every single one of those calls. And we live in a virtual world, so all of those calls are recorded. We do recordings in a safe manner, the whole thing that comes along with it. And then I invest the time to review the call with the salesperson as soon as possible, or I will review the recording separately and provide notes and feedback on that, so that the next time that person has another call, they're 1% better than they were the last call. And if we have 40 calls over the span of 3 months, my salesperson has probably improved 60 to 80% from the first call. So those are a couple of ideas that I have about how to create sort of that emotional connection to make people better within that environment.
Yeah, I like that a lot. I imagine you've got to deal with moods and energy quite a bit on the sales side. And I know, so maybe people who don't like sales or aren't in sales and feel that hard grind of it. Talk about when you shift your mind to being one in service of others. Have you seen that ever kind of change the energy when you've got a mindset of service versus, maybe the metric?
Right. So it's a great statement. I mean, realistically, that's all we are. In business, we're in service of somebody else, right? We're in service of each other as team members. We're in service of each other as our clients. We're constantly serving each other. And so one of the key metrics that you're trying to see is from an emotional perspective, does this person view themselves as having to be in service? Right? Then it becomes a lot easier for you to have that conversation. And the whole conversation about closing rates and metrics and quotas, all that stuff goes away if the leader has that view that that's what their responsibility is to do. My job as a leader is to make everybody around me better and to make myself irrelevant. And the sooner I do that, the better my team gets and the higher our performance gets.
Yeah, we've got a question here coming in. We're live, so please forward your questions. This question is from Martha. With the rise of remote work, maintaining team cohesion is challenging. Yeah, I'll say. How do you see the principles of emotional intelligence adapting to support remote teams and create a connected culture?
That's a good question.
Okay, so I've been working remotely since before it was cool.
So yeah, you got a running start into the pandemic.
Correct. Exactly. So the way that I think about it is as follows. Okay. Remote teams are not any different than co-located teams. They just interact with each other in different tools, and their interruptions are different. So you have to set specific time blocks for teams to do work together or to do activities together. So one of the things that we normally do is we have a weekly training session where we cover some kind of material during that training session. So it could be something about, so we had a team that wanted to learn about copywriting. So we bought a book and we did a book review. Every week we read two chapters in the book review, and we walked through the material and we related it to experiences that we had with the work that we were doing. Another way to think about this is that if you have the budget to do some kind of co-located activity once a quarter or once every 6 months, where somebody comes together, I guarantee you that just doing that one thing will create and strengthen the bonds between the team members. And it could be centered around a conference that you're normally going to go to, or it could not be. It doesn't make any difference, right? What it could be. I had where I live, there's a world-class chef. I have a friend who's a world-class chef. He occasionally has people over. So I invited I brought all my team in, and we had brunch at his house. And it was a fantastic morning, fantastic afternoon. Everybody hung out and did what they wanted to do. And then everybody went back to work the next day. So small things like that go a long way. And what I found is that also understanding that the majority of remote tools are asynchronous, but you have, so for example, I have Slack, we use Slack, right? Slack is our asynchronous communication tool, but there are tremendous ways within Slack that you can communicate with each other. You can create a video in Slack and send it to somebody.
Yeah.
And they can look at it whenever they want to look at it. But they instead of seeing numbers typed on the screen, they see my face talking to them.
Yeah,
I think that's your voice.
I think that's important too, is a lot of times is just being able to see your face, make sure you get those connections. I know, like, what we miss are those a lot of times those little things, like, your typical, the water cooler or whatever, you're going over to the fridge or something to get something out, and you talk to someone about just some small little thing about their life. And now when you're remote, now you have to make almost an intentional effort, like you said, having more of those little events,
Right. And part of your role as a team leader, whether it's a sales leader or anything else, is to make sure that you're having effective one-on-one meetings with your team. And I think a lot of times what happens in co-located teams is the effectiveness of one-on-ones is very poor, because you can just pop in and see somebody. And so there isn't sort of a measured or strategic method to have an individual meeting with a team member. It's like, okay, every Wednesday at 10:30, we're going to have our one-on-one, or every other week, we're going to have our one-on-one. But you have to have that if you're a remote team. If you're a co-located team, you might have it on your calendar, but you know what? I got to go do something this, or I got to go do this, and we can catch up in 20 minutes, or it doesn't work that way in the remote environment.
Yeah.
Right. Because if we're working effectively, we're blocking our time and doing tasks within those time blocks.
Yeah. Just to add a little bit, to that point about the remote work, one, what I'm sort of hearing is make the time, right? Is you have to be able to, like you did with the meal, or, making the time to schedule one-on-one, is you have to forcefully, think about, I have to make the time. And then even I find it in my own experience with our team that, allow the time for the human connection to build versus just jumping right into an agenda and just getting business done is, and you also think it's funny, right? Because we have never been co-located with our customers, right? But what do we do whenever there's a challenge or a difficulty or maybe an opportunity with a customer? We go and see them. We go and have a meal with them. We schedule meetings, right? We make the time to be there. Maybe just the set of expectations was always a little bit different with coworkers, but maybe now with the pandemic or remote work, changing of that expectation to allow for the relationship to foster and build. So I
totally agree. I totally agree with you. I mean, it's because we're now being intentional with our time instead of being haphazard with it, right?
Yeah.
And I think that when we're intentional with our time, we use it more effectively and with greater agency.
Yeah.
And if there's one thing that I could say that I try to do from an emotional intelligence perspective is to make sure that people have agency to make choices in terms of what they want to do with their work.
Mm.
And that's hard for a lot of senior managers who grew up in a co-located environment because I used to work at a place where I had to get into the office before the boss got in. I literally was like, I showed up once at 8:30 in the morning, and the guy who I directly reported to said, Phil gets in at 8:30. You need to be here at 8:15. I was like, okay, if that's the expectation, that's the expectation. Right.
We need to suck your soul 15 minutes earlier than
look at and that's fine. In the investment world, there's lots of horror stories about the hours we work and whatever the case is. And people do it because they want to do it. They don't do it because they have to do it. If they didn't want to do it, they would quit. And by the way, they quit in droves.
Yeah.
They don't stick around, right? And when an investment banking analyst hits the 2-year mark, they have already figured out where they're going in the next 6 months.
Yeah, Mike, you're from that background a bit, right? Is this your experience?
Yeah, it's bringing back some horror stories. Yeah, no, but that's definitely very very true. And industries evolve, companies evolve, and I think the brands and the companies that do are the ones that end up standing out. So, Blair, I want to go back a little bit to Steve's previous question related to the data-driven piece, because we've all heard the famous Peter Drucker quote about what gets measured gets managed.
Sure.
But EQ being a little bit of a softer type of skill. How do you measure the impact of that EQ on the business outcomes, and how do you quantify its meaning for business leaders?
This is a tough question, Mike. I asked, I'm always looking for these soft metrics that relate to stuff like this. And I know it's like for people like, it's just really tough because it's a different way of thinking about something. We're always focused on certain KPIs, but then it's like, okay, what are these sort of, love-based KPIs, or these, KPIs that deal with connection and stuff. And so I think, a lot of times with EQ and stuff, one of those might be like retention, right? Just people are happier to work there. But it's very hard to figure out sometimes what some of these KPIs are.
So let's think about it in an environment. Let's think about it differently. Okay. When we know someone is in a connected, helpful, supportive environment, how do they behave?
Mm-hmm.
Let's think about it from that perspective. People who are in those environments, okay, typically put up their hand to work on projects, do things that are outside of their traditional skill or scope or work process.
Right.
Have no problem staying till 3:00 in the morning to work on a project. once, twice, whatever the case is. Will go get coffee for a colleague who's knee deep in a bunch of spreadsheets and hasn't eaten in 9 hours. True story, happened to me. I was working on closing a fairly substantial deal for one of the firms I was working at. It was probably the biggest deal of the year. And I had been in the office until 2:00 in the morning for many, many, many days. Starting at 9, getting there at 2, and then just going. There was a time where we were near closing, and I called our lawyer at 2:00 in the morning, and whose office building was across from where we were. And I said, "Hey, how's it going?" And he said, "Yeah, I said, and then I waved at him from the office, right? The next day, our assistant, because we had a shared assistant, she saw that my lunch from the day before was still in the fridge. She came in at like 12:00, 12:30. She said, "Blair, have you eaten lunch in the last 2 days?" And I said, "No." I was like, I couldn't even imagine. I said, "No." She says, "I'm going to go get you your lunch." So those are the kinds of behaviors that we want to see when we're working in a high EQ environment, where people want to serve each other because they want to serve the greater good of the organization.
Yeah, I think, this comes back to kind of a transition that we're doing at our company right now, where, we've done a lot of EQ training and we've had this goal of just connection. Always just been a goal of connection. And now we're shifting to more of a self-managed team environment, right? So you really need that awareness and to be working together. So I think, to your point, it's part of the evolution of business consciousness, is to kind of have to start with EQ in a way in order to get to this point where connection is the goal. And then you can start really making a team that is got each other's backs, right? And is working together and is way more effective than, that top-down management of a team where you're cracking the whip and stuff like that.
Right. I would agree with you. I would agree with you completely. And in fact, if you step into a rowing 8, you need 9 people to make the 8 go where it's supposed to go. In fact, you don't need 9, you need 10. You need a coach, right? You need a coxie, and you need 8 rowers, and you need a coach, because an 8 without a coach is basically 9 people just splashing about in the water. So thinking about it from that perspective, okay, what you need to be thinking about is the only way we achieve our objective is if we work together for the betterment of everyone. And that is a high EQ environment.
Yeah. This part of the conversation actually made me think a little bit of our episode last week, right? So we met with Ram Ganasan, who's the founder of Kaboom AI. And his tool essentially tries to help sales teams to build a relationship better with their existing customers. And it just made me think of like how, if you have very high EQ with what is going on with your customers, in the end, that's going to translate into sales performance. It's going to translate into fostering or forging like a much greater relationship between you and that customer. So I would say in the end, EQ will translate into better sales performance.
Right. So
and with the tool, even like with Kaboom AI, it will help you to be better at that relationship building. So maybe if you are looking for a specific metric where how to quantify EQ, I would say in the end you're going to see it internally, like with less absenteeism, more involvement with the greater purpose of the company, and then probably even externally, with stronger relationships with your customers, and look at that sales metric.
Yeah, you could see metrics. So to follow on with what you said, Mike. The simple metrics are: what is the level of churn? Right? How often does a client leave? Right? How often does a client return? Because in the agency business, clients leave all the time for all different reasons, right?
Right.
And then, so surprisingly, they come back 12 months later because they need a different piece of work done, because they need to make an update, because the place where they went to treated them like crap.
Right.
They didn't get the same level of experience, whatever the case could possibly be. Yeah. So, the two simplest ways to determine whether or not your high EQ environment is helping your existing customers is level of churn and volume of repeat business.
Right.
And not just from like the total dollar volume, but also number of new existing customers that are re-upping, right? So if you have 100 customers that are paying you, $10,000 a month, right? And then 6 months later, you have 50 customers that are paying you $10,050 a month. That is telling you of those, and then another 50 that are paying you still the $10,000. That's telling you that something is going on within your organization, that you're able to capture an extra $50 in value.
For sure. So I want to take another question. Thanks, Blair. I want to take another question here from Gabe Molinas, who's joining us from Facebook. Gabe, thanks for joining us. He asked, you mentioned your sales team. Can you share an example of how emotional intelligence has been used to enhance collaboration between different departments or teams in the company?
Sure. Thanks, Gabriel, for that question. So I'm a big fan of what we call the Chief Revenue Officer role. And I mean, not the VP of sales with the Chief Revenue Officer title. The Chief Revenue Officer is responsible for the entire revenue function and the entire revenue journey, from acquisition to retention. And so what does that mean? It means that all of the different functions within that revenue function have to work together and collaborate together. And the things that I just briefly talked about, making sure that there are regular interactions, also has to happen with all the functions. So that means that there should be a regular revenue meeting between marketing, customer success, customer service, sales enablement, sales, could be sales engineering or technical sales, whatever the case is. There needs to be a regular meeting with all of those teams on the leadership, and a regular get together, virtual or non-virtual, of all of those individuals on the team, so that people know who they are. When I worked at an enterprise software firm, I knew who everybody on the sales engineering team was. I knew who everybody in the sales team was. I knew who everybody in the marketing team was, and everybody on the enablement and customer success teams were. And that was because I made the effort to get to know everybody. So that's the quickest and easiest way to answer that question. But I'm not a big fan of meeting-itis. I find that there's a lot of companies that, if you take a look at them, if you were to look at your calendar, you're probably going to find that 20% of your work week is dedicated to internal meetings. And I feel that we're wasting everybody's time because they're not getting the opportunity to do their work. So we need to use tools or methods that allow us to make those connections without necessarily taking up a lot of time.
Yeah, for sure. And I'd say at least 20%. In some organizations, I think.
Depends on the function, right?
Right. Yeah.
I'll give you. There's an influencer, whatever his name is. His name is Alex Hormozy. You might have heard of him. Alex has divided the world into two different types of people at work: makers and managers. And makers are the people that do work and make stuff happen, are creative and drive businesses. And managers, their output is measured by the number of meetings they have every week. right?
Yeah,
And
I can relate.
kind of tongue in cheek, but you know,
Sure.
my brother's a CFO of a reasonably sized company, and I appreciate it. He doesn't really do work anymore. His job is to connect different people to the finance team.
Right.
You know, Blair, you're mentioning kind of that role of integrating all the different parts of the company together. I think that's kind of a huge thing that people have to be aware of, is what's that entire customer journey? Because, you know, once it gets past, you know, you've made the sale, you're still in this customer journey, and it's like the consumption of the service or the product. This is really a huge point for your marketing and sales, is because you want to create someone who's a brand ambassador, or who's, you know, very loyal to you, or giving you that word of mouth. And so so you're talking about, I mean, you pay attention to that whole journey from you know, from your marketing side of the business to.
Sure, absolutely, 100%. So let's just think about it like it from this perspective. Okay, we're going to run digital ads to try and attract people to our offering and what we're doing. Well, there is a production team that actually is responsible for those ads. What a surprise! I'm sure you guys are familiar with this.
Just a little.
Just a little. And so it's important that someone be responsible for the messaging, to make sure that the messaging is online with what the entire brand messaging looks like. Now, there are many ways to be tongue-in-cheek with this, and I've been accused of that many times. But in general, the spirit should be that how we sell should be congruent with how we service.
Yeah,
how
I
we
need to say that again and emphasize that point a little bit and go into, because I think that's so important to it.
Okay. So how we sell should be congruent with how we service. Meaning that if we have a high level of service, then our sales process, and what I mean by sales, I mean sales, brand, messaging, conversations, methodologies, it should all be congruent with the way that we service a client. So when we tell a client that we can do something in 15 days, we also need to make sure that we show up for our meetings on time. Because that means to a client that we value their time and we meet our commitments. And that is a cultural thing. When we tell a client we're going to deliver by a certain time, we deliver by that time, just like how we show up on time for our meetings and in advance and prepared.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I know from our business, a lot of times it's, you know, we have the philosophy, it's about this podcast, it's like build love into scalable systems. So we're trying to build love into this, trying to build empathy in everything we do. And so we have to have, like, you know, our sales staff very empathetic, but then when they hand it over to, you know, the service side, you've got to have the same thing. If there's a disconnect here from everything we've talked about, then it kind of all falls apart, because that authenticity kind of, you know, gets slapped in the face, and you're there with like this big disconnect from what you said you are and what you are. You got to walk the walk in every part of the business.
Correct. And I love the way that you position that, is that it has to be congruent. We have to lead with empathy throughout the entire organization. And the only way that happens is if there is a tone from the top that exemplifies that.
Yeah, for sure. That makes a ton of sense. So Blair, one of the things that, you know, we always like to emphasize on this show is really the importance of connection. You know, having, you know, connection in our community, connection, you know, with customers, and human connection. And it just seems like, you know, we've talked about in previous shows that there's a lack of connection, and we feel somewhat disconnected. So I was kind of curious for your thought on, what would you say to us? Like, what could we do today to try to perhaps remedy that situation, try to fix it, to develop more connection?
Great. Okay. So connection is literally, so I believe that sales is a human to human interaction.
Mm-hmm.
It is not a bot talking to a human. It is a human to human interaction. Even if the medium that connects or communicates is a bot, it is still a human that does the interaction. It's still a human that created the algorithm to run the bot. The question, though, is how do we make sure that we have this connection between two different humans? And the way to do that is to make sure that everybody knows that connection is the most important part of that. And I'll just give you a brief example. I have teams that make cold calls, right? I don't know when I was in my 20s, I hated making cold calls. But here's what happened. I had a battle buddy. And my battle buddy and I would go into a conference room with a bunch of cards or a book with a bunch of companies, and we would just start making calls. And we would do that for 45 minutes every day. And at the end of 45 minutes, cold calling was not hard for me to do. I just needed a battle buddy to get me going.
Mm-hmm.
And so I do that with our team members as well. If we're struggling with something, we will jump on a Zoom and we will do it together. And so you want to create connectedness. That's the simplest way that I know how to do that, is to say, I'm prepared as a leader or just as a human being to help you get through this thing, whatever that is.
Yeah, that's a good point. Good reminder.
Battle buddy, you're getting in the trenches together, right?
Right. Exactly. That's exactly it.
So, Blair, to wrap up, I want to ask you a question that often sparks debate, especially when EQ isn't there. What do you think about people who say that love doesn't belong in business?
I say that they should probably go. They should probably go do something else.
Do something else.
They should go
find something else they love, right?
I don't know, like go into a lab and run a bunch of experiments where you don't have to talk to people all day, every day, right? The word love is a charged word. I don't believe that businesses are families. I believe that they're businesses and they have missions and purposes. But I do believe it is possible to create a high level of emotional connectedness between the people that are within an organization. There are many people that I worked with 20 years ago that I still am connected with, because he was my battle buddy, right? Because she was my assistant who knew when I had a bad day. So how do we bring love in? By being human and being real and understanding that people have emotions and feelings, and regardless of what you're going through today, someone is going through something else. And I think that's the simplest and easiest way to make sure that love stays in business.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
I love that answer.
Great answer.
Blair, it's been fantastic having you on the podcast today. Appreciate all the insights you shared on this topic. For our listeners who want to learn more or connect with you, where can they find you?
Easiest way is to go to our website, InsideCRO.com, or you can find me on LinkedIn, Blair Carey. I'm pretty much one of the only Blair Careys on LinkedIn, so you can find me there. Those are the two easiest ways to get a hold of me.
Real quick, tell everyone what InsideCRO does.
So basically, InsideCRO is an organization that helps primarily technology companies find their ideal clients through a variety of different means. And we typically focus on industrial technology clients. They're trying to find companies in the water, wastewater, oil and gas, energy, manufacturing spaces. That's where we really shine. Although we do work in other spaces, but if your client is an oil and gas processor in Midland, Texas, we probably know who they are.
Well, thank you again, Blair, for joining us. Thank you to our listeners. Reminder, we've got shows Tuesday, Wednesday, and we are live on Thursdays. Until next time, everyone, keep building love into your business, and we will see you on the next Bliss Business Podcast.
Thank you.
See you later.